8 months ago, I stood in front of my husband's coffin, watched the lid close, and believed everything was over. I cried. I signed the death certificate. I taught myself how to keep living in an empty house. But yesterday afternoon, in the middle of a crowded street, I saw him. Not someone who looked like him. It was him. He was holding the hand of a little boy, maybe 6 years old, bending down to buy him an ice cream cone, then smiling when the child called him Dad. My name is Margaret Lewis. I am 67 years old, and I live alone in a house in suburban Chicago after my husband, Richard Lewis, died 8 months ago. Life after the funeral moved through a long, stretched-out silence where every habit felt hollow without the man who had been beside me for more than 35 years. Richard had always seemed dependable in everyone's eyes. He worked in finance and always carried himself like a man who had everything under control. I trusted him, not only as a husband, but as the person I believed I knew better than anyone else in the world. But yesterday afternoon, when I saw him standing on the street calling a little boy my son, everything I had ever believed started to collapse. He did not panic. He did not look shocked that I had found him. He simply looked at me and chose to turn away. And in that moment, only one question rose in my mind. What was the truth about Richard Lewis's death these past 8 months? That afternoon had started like any other day I had grown used to after losing my husband, when every activity moved with a slower rhythm and without any sense of anticipation. I was standing in line at a small coffee shop near the corner, holding my wallet, staring through the clear glass outside just to pass the time. The street was crowded as usual, the noise of traffic blending with scattered conversations into the kind of background sound I no longer noticed. And I had no reason to think that just a few seconds later, my entire sense of reality would be overturned in a way I could not explain. I saw him before I even understood what I was looking at. A familiar silhouette, so familiar that my body reacted before my mind could catch up. Richard was standing across the street, under the shade of a tree near an ice cream cart, wearing a light-colored shirt I had never seen him wear before. But the way he leaned slightly to one side, the way he rested a hand on the shoulder of the child beside him, was too familiar to mistake. I did not move right away, because part of me refused to accept what was happening. I had stood over his coffin. I had looked at what I believed was him. I had heard the sound of dirt falling onto the casket lid on a cold afternoon 8 months earlier. But the man standing out there was not a blurry shape or an illusion created by grief. He was a real human being, every gesture clear, every movement carrying weight. Beside him stood a little boy, maybe 5 years old, holding a melting ice cream cone that was dripping faster than he could eat it. When some of it slid onto the boy's hand, Richard bent down immediately, pulled a tissue from his pocket, and carefully wiped it away with the kind of patience I had seen 1,000 times before. I stepped out of line, leaving my order behind while someone called my name from inside, and pushed through the door into the street without even remembering how I crossed it. The distance between us closed one step at a time, and I could feel my heart pounding harder, not from fear, but from something I could not name, something both familiar and utterly foreign all at once. "Richard," I called, and my voice came out clearer than I expected. He turned around. His eyes met mine, and in that instant I waited for a reaction, any reaction at all that would confirm he knew me. But what I saw was not panic. It was not confusion. He looked at me with perfect calm, as if I were nothing more than a stranger who had called out the wrong name on the street. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice polite and even. "You've mistaken me for someone else." That sentence stopped me in the middle of my next step. I stared at him, searching for any sign that he was pretending, but his expression remained steady. The little boy grabbed his hand tighter and looked up at me with the natural curiosity of a child who had no idea what was going on. I stepped closer, feeling the truth slipping away from me unless I held on to it. "Richard, it's me, Margaret. The wife who lived with you for 35 years. We even have a son together," I said, my voice lower this time, as if I were trying to keep the world around us from breaking apart. He did not step back, but he did not move toward me either. He simply stood there, one hand still resting on the child's shoulder, his face unchanged. "You really do have the wrong person," he repeated, and this time there was an extra touch of patience in his tone, as though he were explaining a small misunderstanding. I stood there in the middle of a street I knew by heart, a street that had suddenly turned strange, staring at the man I had buried 8 months ago as he denied the entire life we had shared. "Richard, look at me," I said, not loudly, but firmly, as if I were trying to hold both of us inside the same reality. He looked at me, this time for a second longer, but there was still no sign of recognition in his eyes. "I think you're confusing me with someone else," he said, his voice calm in a way that felt almost terrifying, as if he had rehearsed that sentence many times before. The little boy beside him tugged gently at his sleeve and whispered something I could not hear. Richard bent down, answered him with a soft smile, and did it so naturally it was as if speaking to me were only a minor interruption in an otherwise ordinary afternoon. A woman standing nearby, someone I had never seen before, stepped closer. She placed a hand on the child's shoulder, then looked at me with an expression caught between concern and annoyance. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone openly protective. Richard turned to her and gave the slightest shake of his head, as if reassuring her that everything was under control. "Just some misunderstanding, or a crazy woman," he said, then turned back to me. "You should go home and get some rest." That sentence sent a coldness through my chest. "I'm not confused, and I'm not crazy," I said, my voice lower now but clearer. "We were married for 35 years. I buried you 8 months ago." The words left my mouth with a weight even I had not expected, and for one brief second, I hoped they would crack the calm shell he was holding so tightly around himself. The woman tightened her hand on the child's shoulder and pulled him closer to her, as if I were some kind of threat she needed to protect him from. "You're bothering my family," she said, her voice firmer now. "If you have a problem, call the police, but don't stand here saying things like that in front of my son." Richard did not interrupt her. He did not correct a single detail. He simply stood there, playing the role of a stranger trying to end an uncomfortable situation. He looked at me one more time, but this time his gaze did not linger. It was shorter now, more final. "We have to go," he said, then placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and gently guided him forward. I came home in a state I could not name, not panicked, not fully calm either, but something like a long blank stretch inside my thoughts. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning when I left. Everything was in its usual place, but the familiarity no longer felt safe. I set my purse down on the table, stood still in the living room for a moment, then walked slowly toward the cabinet where I had kept all the important documents after Richard's funeral. I did not think too much. I simply followed some instinct inside me that kept pushing me to check everything again. I took out the file I had kept neatly organized, placed it on the table, and opened it one page at a time. The death certificate lay right on top, with the proper signatures and the official seal, listing the date and the cause of death I had read over and over in the weeks after he died. I put my hand on the paper and read every line again as if it were the first time, trying to find some detail that could explain what I had just seen. But everything was still there, exactly as it had been before, with no obvious mistake, no sign of confusion. I turned to the funeral photographs, to the moments I had once believed marked the end of a life. I saw myself standing beside the coffin, my face drawn and exhausted, my eyes swollen from crying, friends and relatives around me offering condolences. The coffin had been kept closed almost from the beginning of the service, with the explanation that the condition of the body made it inappropriate to leave the lid open for long. At the time, I had not questioned it. I had trusted what I was told, and I had not had the strength to doubt anything. I remembered the moment the coffin was lowered. That sound still lived in my memory with terrible clarity. People stood around me. Some rested their hands on my shoulder and said comforting things I could no longer remember exactly. I had believed I was saying a final goodbye. I had believed everything was over, and that all I had to do was learn how to keep living with the loss. But now, sitting there with those papers spread in front of me, the images of that afternoon pushed themselves into those memories and made the whole story feel fractured. Then I stopped on a detail I had ignored before. The time between when Richard was taken to the funeral home and the funeral itself had been shorter than I now thought it should have been, but back then I assumed it was just the way things were handled. I also remembered that I was never left alone with his body for very long. There was always someone nearby, guiding me through the next step, explaining the procedures, telling me what to do next. At the time, I accepted everything as part of the process. I never asked more questions because I believed there was no reason to doubt. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I went back to the same street at almost the exact same time and chose a spot across from the ice cream stand, where I could watch without drawing attention. I sat in the car with my hands on the steering wheel and kept my eyes fixed on the storefront. Everything moved more slowly than I expected, but that did not make me impatient. I understood that if he really was living somewhere nearby, he would appear in some kind of rhythm, and all I had to do was stay there long enough to see it. Almost an hour later, I saw them. The woman from the day before walked ahead, holding a shopping bag. The little boy ran beside her with the bright, careless energy of an ordinary afternoon. And behind them, Richard stepped out of a nearby building, closed the door with a gesture I had seen thousands of times in our old life, and followed them. This time I did not feel shock, because I had prepared myself for the possibility, but something still tightened in my chest as I realized what I had seen the day before had not been a mistake. I did not step out right away. I watched the way they moved together. Richard placed a hand on the little boy's shoulder when he ran too far ahead, spoke to him gently in a tone I knew well. The woman turned back to say something to him, and he answered with an easy smile, showing no tension, no sign of fear. Everything between them felt natural, so natural that if I had not known the truth, I would have believed they were just another family. I took out my phone and began recording what I was seeing, not to prove it to anyone else yet, but to make sure I would never be forced to doubt my own mind. I took pictures. I recorded video. I captured every detail I could, the way they walked, the way they stopped to talk, the way he held himself around them. I no longer needed to walk up and confront him again. I understood by then that the answer did not depend on whether he admitted the truth. It depended on the fact that he was living a completely different life from the one I had known. When they turned down a smaller street, I waited a few minutes, got out of the car, and followed on foot from far enough away that they would not notice me. I watched them walk into a small house with a white fence, the kind of house that was not large, but clearly well cared for. Richard opened the door, held it for the woman and the child, then stepped inside after them and closed it behind him as if he belonged there. I went back to my car, sat down, and looked again at what I had recorded. The images on the screen left no room for denial, and strangely, that gave me a kind of steadiness I had never expected to feel in a situation like this. I was no longer standing between two impossible possibilities. I was a woman staring at a truth that now needed to be understood, and from that moment on, I knew I would not stop at watching from a distance. I would find the full story behind the life Richard had chosen to live without me. Once I knew where he was living, I understood that the next step could not stop at observation, because I needed to know under what name that man was existing and how he had built an entirely new life without leaving obvious traces behind. I did not act impulsively. Instead, I began with small steps, the same way I had handled complicated situations in the past when everything had to be checked from the most basic details first. I returned to the neighborhood on different days, recorded the times he came and went, watched how the people around him interacted with him, and slowly realized that, to them, he was not some man who had just appeared. He was already a familiar part of the area. One morning, I went into a grocery store nearby, one where I had previously seen the woman with him shop. I picked up a few things I did not actually need, just to give myself a reason to stay a little longer and listen to the conversations around me. At the register, I started asking the cashier about the neighborhood, pretending I was thinking about moving there. The conversation unfolded naturally, and when I mentioned the house with the white fence, she nodded right away. "Oh, Daniel's house," she said, as if the name meant nothing unusual at all. "That family is so sweet. They moved here about a year ago." I kept my tone casual and asked a few more questions, the way any interested stranger might. She told me the man's name was Daniel Moore, that he worked in financial consulting, and that people saw him all the time with his wife and son. Nothing in the way she said it carried the slightest suspicion. She was simply describing a family she had seen many times. I thanked her, left the store, and felt a coldness spread through my chest, because that name was not some temporary cover. It was an identity that had been built solidly enough to be trusted. I kept searching for information through public sources, starting with the databases anyone can access if they know where to look. The name Daniel Moore came up with a full record, address, and even a work history stretching back through recent years. The information fit together cleanly. There were no obvious gaps, no visible rupture, as if this life had existed continuously with no interruption at all. That made me sit longer in front of the screen than I expected, because I understood that creating a record like that could not have been some impulsive decision. It had to have been the result of a deliberate plan. I also noticed that the time he had moved into that neighborhood almost aligned with the period just before Richard's death was announced. That overlap no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like proof that the two lives had been arranged to exist side by side for some time. I sat there looking at the records, trying to fit the dates together, and I began seeing gaps I had never noticed before. Business trips Richard used to talk about, stretches of time he had been away with explanations I had accepted without question. What I felt then was no longer the first shock. It was something colder and clearer. A sharp wakefulness that made each detail more distinct. The man I had lived with was not simply alive. He was living another life with another name, another history, and another family that everyone around him believed was real. And what kept me staring at that screen longer than anything else was not just the existence of the new identity, but how complete it was, as if he had been preparing for this moment long before I ever suspected anything. One afternoon, I sat in my car at the far end of the street, where I could see the front yard of the house with the white fence. The door opened, and the woman, Lisa, came out first carrying a small bag. The little boy followed her, laughing and talking with the easy comfort of a child who feels safe. A few seconds later, Richard came out, closed the door behind him, crouched down to the child's level, and said something that made the boy laugh even louder. The way he placed a hand on the child's shoulder, the way he adjusted the child's shirt before they walked through the gate, all of it carried a tenderness I had once believed belonged only to our family. I could not stop myself from comparing the scene, not because I wanted to, but because old memories inserted themselves automatically into what I was seeing. When my son was little, Richard had rarely shown that kind of patience. He was often busy, often distracted, often had reasons to be elsewhere. I was the one who filled those empty places. But with this boy, he seemed fully present, unrushed, undivided, and it did more than make me feel replaced. It forced me to question the man I had spent decades living beside. I stood across the street watching that scene like an outsider, and what made it heavy was not simply that he had another family. It was the way he had built it so completely that I could not deny what I was seeing. This was not some new relationship in its beginning. It was not some temporary mistake. It was a full life, formed long enough to be real to everyone inside it. Once I understood that his new identity was not just a temporary cover, I went back into my own past and started looking at it differently, as though I were rereading a story where I had once skipped over important details. I pulled out the financial records I had rarely touched before, not because I did not care, but because I had trusted Richard to handle those matters well. The files were neatly organized in the cabinet, reflecting what had once seemed like a stable life. But when I started reading carefully, I saw gaps I had never thought to question. I opened our old bank statements and followed the money line by line, tracing every transfer, every transaction I had once skimmed over without much thought. At first, everything looked ordinary. But when I compared dates against actual memories, inconsistencies began to appear. There were transfers made at times Richard had claimed to be somewhere else entirely, work trips I had accepted without further thought. The amounts were not large enough to be alarming on their own, but placed side by side, they formed a steady flow toward accounts I did not recognize. I kept digging into those accounts, and although not all of them were easy to trace, I found signs that they were connected to entities Richard had never once mentioned. That made me stop longer over every page, because I realized part of our financial life had been operating beyond anything I had ever been allowed to see. By then, I no longer felt overwhelmed in the way I had those first days. Instead, I felt focused, sharply focused, like I was peeling back a hidden layer of truth piece by piece. I also went back through the jointly held assets we had shared and realized that some of them had already been transferred or restructured in the months before Richard died. The changes themselves had been legal, fully documented, all properly filed. What caught my attention was not just what had been changed, but when and how it had happened. These were not sudden choices. They were part of a sequence, a quiet sequence of deliberate actions that left no obvious trace unless someone actively went looking. And when I put those details together, a picture began to emerge with a clarity I could no longer ignore. Richard had not simply left. He had been preparing to leave for a very long time. The money transfers, the adjusted ownership structures, the parallel identity he had been building, all of it pointed to a plan carried out step by step with extraordinary care. I sat at my desk with all those documents spread out before me, and for the first time, I stopped searching for an emotional explanation for what had happened. I stopped wondering whether he had still loved me, whether any promise we had made to each other had meant anything to him. Instead, I looked at the truth as it existed in front of me, with all its numbers, documents, and evidence, and a thought began forming more clearly in my mind. What I was dealing with was not simply a man who had walked away from a marriage. This was a man who had deliberately erased every trace of his old life in order to construct a new one. Faking his death had not been an emotional choice. It had been a calculated solution, a way of escaping the financial and legal pressure that had slowly been closing in on him. From that moment on, I stopped looking for reasons to understand or sympathize. I started thinking about what needed to happen next. If he had chosen to disappear in order to avoid the consequences of what he had done, then uncovering the truth was no longer just a personal matter. It was the only way to put things back where they belonged. And for the first time since all of this had started, I felt like I was no longer being dragged through his story. I was preparing to write the next part of my own. After piecing all of that together, I realized there was one person I had not questioned hard enough, and that realization made me pause longer than I expected before taking the next step. My son, David, had stayed in regular contact with me for those entire 8 months. He visited on weekends. He called to check on me. He played the role of a caring son, the same way he always had. But when I replayed our recent conversations in my head, I started hearing the pauses I had never noticed before, the answers that came too quickly, and the careful way he seemed to avoid anything connected to Richard. I decided to meet him in person, not in a dramatic setting, but in a familiar one, somewhere I could watch him clearly. I called and invited him to dinner. He agreed immediately, and nothing in his voice sounded strange. But when he walked into the house that evening, I looked at him longer than usual, as if I were searching for some detail I had missed all this time. David hugged me, asked how I had been doing, whether I had been missing Dad again, and everything on the surface felt the same as it always had. But this time, I was no longer in that conversation the way I had once been. We sat down to dinner and talked about ordinary things in his life, his job, his friends, his plans. I listened, but at the same time I watched him. The way he reacted to certain questions, the way his eyes shifted when I brought up small pieces of the past. Then, almost casually, I mentioned seeing a man on the street who looked exactly like Richard, and I saw David stop for the briefest moment before answering. "You probably just miss Dad too much," he said. I set down my knife and fork without making any sudden sound and looked directly at him. "No, I saw your father," I said, each word slow, flat, not dramatic, Simply true. He's living with another woman, and there's a little boy who calls him Dad. What are you talking about? Have you gone crazy from missing him? Dad died 8 months ago. You and I buried him together. I said nothing. I just looked at him, not like some unhinged old woman, but like someone who already knew everything. Then I took out the photos and the videos I had collected and placed them in front of him. I don't know what you're talking about, he finally said, but his voice no longer carried the confidence it had a moment earlier. I'm not asking whether you know what I'm talking about, I said, keeping the same calm tone I had held from the start. I'm asking whether you want to tell me the truth. David did not answer right away, and that delay itself made the room feel heavier in a way I had never experienced before. He sat there, with both hands on the table, his eyes no longer meeting mine, fixed instead on some empty point in the wood grain. Finally, he took a long breath and rubbed his forehead with one hand, a gesture I recognized from the times he had to face something difficult. You're not going to like what I'm about to say, he began, his voice lower than usual, stripped of the certainty I had known. You don't need me to like it, I said. I need the truth. David gave the slightest nod, as if he had finally accepted there was no way out now. Dad didn't die, he said, each word slow, as though he were hearing himself for the first time. I knew before it happened. The sentence did not shock me in the ordinary sense, because I had already prepared myself for that possibility. But hearing it from my own son made it real in a completely different way. How long have you known? I asked, my voice unchanged. He told me things were getting really bad, David said. He said he had no other way out. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. He said if things kept going the way they were, he was going to lose everything, and not just money. I listened, feeling each sentence fall into place like pieces of a puzzle I had never wanted to solve. And what did you do? I asked. It was a simple question, but it carried a weight I did not need to emphasize. This time, David looked up. There was visible strain in his face now. I helped him, he said. His voice lost the steady control he had tried to keep. I didn't know every detail, but I knew he needed to move some money around. He needed to put a few things in order. I thought it was just a way to buy him time. Did you know he was going to fake his death? Lie to me? I asked, my voice lower now, not because I was weakening, but because the question itself crossed into a different kind of pain. No, he said. Then after a second he added, at least, not exactly like that. He inhaled slowly before continuing. He told me he needed to disappear from his old life. He said it was the only way to start over. I didn't think he would take it this far. So, when your father died, you knew it wasn't real? I asked. He did not answer immediately, but this time his silence was answer enough. Then he gave the smallest nod, almost too slight to see if I had not been staring straight at him. Yes, he whispered. I knew. But I thought it was the best thing at the time. The best thing. That phrase echoed in my head in a way I could not ignore. I sat there in silence for several seconds and let those words settle between us. The best thing for who? I finally asked, my voice still under control. David looked at me, and for the first time I saw a conflict in his face he could not hide. For Dad, he said. Then, after a beat, and I thought, for everyone. I did not react right away. But in that moment, I realized that the betrayal I was facing had not come only from the man I had buried. It had also come from the son I had raised. And what made it so heavy was not just what they had done, but the fact that they had decided I did not need to know. They had decided my life could be rearranged without my consent. I looked at him now, not as a mother trying to understand her child, but as someone trying to locate herself inside a story she no longer controlled. So you chose your father's side? I asked. You helped hide his fake death and watched me grieve for 8 months like some foolish old woman? Why? Why would you do that to me? What exactly did you do? David drew in a deep breath and let it out slowly, as though he were trying not to lose control of himself. "I helped him move some money," he said. "I signed a few documents he couldn't sign himself at the time." He stopped and looked at me, as if waiting for some reaction, but I gave him none. I thought it was temporary. I thought everything would be sorted out later. Temporary, I repeated, not to mock him, but so I could hear the exact word he had chosen. "And while your father disappeared, you stayed silent." David nodded slightly. He did not deny it. "I didn't know what else to do," he said. "He told me if this got out, everything would be worse. He said you'd get pulled into things you didn't deserve to deal with." "You made that decision for me," I said. "You decided I didn't need the truth about my own life, and more than that, you decided to betray me and stand there while I suffered." David shook his head, as if he wanted to argue, but stopped halfway through the motion. "I just didn't want things to get worse. I thought if Dad could start over, if he got a chance to fix things, then that was the best outcome." "The best outcome for who?" I asked again, not letting the question slide away unanswered this time. "For Dad," he said. Then after a second, "And I thought for the family." I held his eyes. "What family?" I asked, my voice still low, but sharp enough that he heard everything underneath it. "The family your father is living with now? Or the family you're sitting in front of?" I didn't think it would go this far. I thought he'd come back. I thought he'd sort it out. I thought things would go back to normal. 8 months, I said, without raising my voice. 8 months went by, and you didn't say one word to me. I know I was wrong." I did not answer right away because I understood that sentence did nothing to change what had happened. I looked at him, no longer searching for explanation, only confirming what I had already known from the start of the conversation. "You didn't just keep a secret," I said slowly. "You helped create it." David did not argue, and his silence this time was the clearest confession of all. I leaned back in my chair and felt the way my view of him had shifted, not because I suddenly stopped loving him, but because I finally understood that the relationship between us no longer stood where I had once believed it did. "You thought your father needed an escape," I continued. "But did it ever occur to you that I had the right to know so I could decide for myself how to face what was happening?" And in that moment, I realized what hurt me most was not only the betrayal. It was the way the people I had trusted most had made choices in my place. They had chosen a path, and I had never even been allowed into the conversation. After that conversation with David, I did not collapse the way I once imagined I might. Instead, a very clear stillness settled inside me, as if all emotion had been organized and pushed aside to make room for one specific purpose. I remained sitting in the living room long after he left, staring into the familiar emptiness of the room, which now carried an entirely different meaning. And for the first time since all of this began, I stopped looking outward for answers. I had enough information now. What I needed next was not more explanation. It was a decision about what I was going to do with the truth I had. The next morning, I started by organizing everything I had collected: the pictures, the videos from the neighborhood, the financial documents, the details David had confirmed. I opened my laptop, created a separate folder, and arranged everything in chronological order, just as I used to when I needed to understand something complex. Every file, every image, every line of notes went exactly where it belonged, not because I needed to remember, but because I needed to be able to present it clearly when the time came. I also reached out to a lawyer I had known for years, someone with experience in cases involving financial misconduct and identity issues. When we met, I did not tell the story emotionally. I laid out the evidence piece by piece, every detail I had verified. He listened, asking occasional questions to sharpen one point or another. And the deeper we went, the more obvious it became that what I was dealing with was not only personal betrayal. It was something that could carry serious legal consequences. My lawyer explained that faking a death to escape financial and legal obligations could lead to very serious charges, especially when multiple people were involved and there was evidence of asset transfers beforehand. He also made it clear that collecting and preserving evidence had to be handled carefully, so that everything could be used properly when needed. I took in every word, not because I still needed convincing, but because I was preparing for what came next. In the days that followed, I kept watching Richard, though by then my purpose had changed. I was no longer trying to understand his new life. I was gathering what I needed to prove that two identities had been maintained side by side. I recorded the times he came and went. I noted meetings. I watched small exchanges, the kinds of things visible from a distance. I never moved closer than necessary, because I understood that distance was part of keeping control. With the lawyer's help, I returned to the financial records and traced more clearly the money that had been moved and the assets that had been changed before Richard died. The details I had once only seen in fragments now fit into a much larger picture, and that made the whole thing impossible to deny. This had never been random. It had been a structured plan. What surprised me most during that process was my own calm. I no longer felt any need to confront Richard face to face and demand an explanation, because I understood that whatever he said now could not undo what he had already done. Instead, I focused on making sure the truth was fully documented, preserved, and impossible to distort. One evening, while I was reviewing everything I had gathered, I realized I had shifted from being someone trapped inside his story into someone shaping what would happen next. I did not need to rush. I did not need some dramatic confrontation. Everything would happen at the right time, with the right evidence, in the right order. And from that moment on, I knew the story would not end in silence or quiet acceptance. It would be brought into the light in a way no one could deny. And for the first time since I saw Richard alive on that street, I no longer felt passive. I felt like I was steadily shaping the ending of this story for myself. I knew the right moment to appear would not come from some random confrontation in public. It had to happen in a setting where everyone involved was present, where the truth could not be minimized into some private misunderstanding. That opportunity came when I realized Richard was preparing to host a birthday party for the little boy. It was intimate enough to feel like a family event, but large enough that the truth, once spoken, would spread immediately. I knew about the party from the days I spent watching them. I saw them bringing home decorations, gift bags, even a birthday cake ordered from a nearby bakery. I did not show up at the beginning. Instead, I parked a few houses away and sat in the car watching the event unfold. The house with the white fence had been decorated with bright ribbons and balloons tied along the walkway. Children's laughter drifted out from the backyard. The whole scene felt warm in the simple way that any stranger passing by would have recognized, the image of a whole, happy family. If I had not known the truth, I might have believed it too. I watched Richard move through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling, talking with a kind of ease I had once thought belonged to him by nature. He crouched down when the child ran toward him, adjusted the boy's party hat, then stood again to take a drink from Lisa. She stayed close beside him, chatting with the other women, sometimes turning to him with the kind of smile that comes from complete trust. There was nothing in the picture to suggest this life had been built on a lie, at least not to anyone there, but I no longer felt dragged around by the emotions that had ruled those first days. I looked at that scene the way someone looks at a painting after learning the whole story behind it. I noted every detail, not because I still needed more proof, but because I wanted to see how thoroughly he had settled into this new life. The guests congratulated him. They called him by the name I had already found in the records. None of them had any reason to suspect otherwise, and I realized then that this was not some small side arrangement. It was part of their daily life. Neighbors arrived with gifts. Children ran across the lawn. The entire atmosphere carried a kind of stability I had once believed only truth could create. That made one thing clear. If I stepped into that scene, it would not just be a personal confrontation. It would be a rupture in the whole structure Richard had created. I checked the time, not because I was waiting for some exact minute, but because I wanted to be sure everyone who mattered had arrived. When I saw that the guests were all there, when the laughter had reached its fullest point and people were starting to gather around the birthday cake, I knew that every eye would soon be focused on one place. That was the moment. I turned off the engine, took a slow breath, and stepped out of the car. The afternoon air was cooler than I expected, but it did nothing to disturb the steadiness in my steps. I carried no hurry with me. I carried no hesitation either. What I carried was the full truth I had collected, and a decision that this story would not remain in the dark any longer. As I walked toward the gate, the laughter still floated through the yard, and for the first few seconds no one noticed me. I stopped for just one brief moment, looked at the scene in front of me, then kept walking, knowing that from this second forward, nothing would remain the same. I stepped through the white gate I had only ever watched from across the street before, and I could feel the shift in the space the moment I entered a part of his life I had never been invited into. The party noise continued, as if nothing had happened, children's laughter mixing with the low murmur of adult conversation, and for the first few seconds no one paid any attention to me. I walked slowly, not trying to blend in, not looking lost either, just moving forward like a late guest no one had identified yet. A few people near the walkway glanced at me with mild curiosity, the way people do when they are trying to place someone unfamiliar at a gathering. I gave a polite nod to a woman standing close by when our eyes met, and she returned it with the automatic social smile people give when they accept someone's presence without questioning it. That small exchange allowed me to move farther into the yard without drawing resistance, and I realized that being overlooked at first gave me exactly the advantage I needed. I stopped where I could clearly see the center of the party, where the table with the birthday cake had become the focus of everyone's attention. The little boy stood in the middle wearing a bright paper hat, surrounded by other children who laughed and waited for the candles to be lit. Lisa stood beside him with one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, her face turned toward the guests with visible pride. And just a few steps away, Richard was in the middle of a conversation with a middle-aged man, still wearing that same polished confidence I had seen on the street before. I did not approach him right away. I stayed in that space for a few more seconds, watching how the scene moved without me, how naturally everything seemed to function. Then Richard turned. His eyes moved across the crowd the way they naturally would during any party, and then stopped when they found me. That moment lasted less than a second, but it was long enough for me to see the tiniest fracture in his expression, a flash of recognition he could not stop. And yet instead of reacting, he forced his eyes away, as though he could keep the party flowing if he refused to acknowledge what had just entered it. I took a few more steps and shortened the distance between us. This time, more people began to notice me. A woman standing near Richard gave me a puzzled look, then turned toward him and asked something in a voice too low for me to catch. He answered briefly, keeping his tone normal, and that was when I knew he was trying to control this moment the same way he had controlled the one on the street. Lisa noticed me too. Her eyes stayed on me longer than anyone else's. She moved one step closer to Richard, as though she needed confirmation, then looked back at me with clearer caution. I still said nothing. I did not introduce myself. I knew this moment did not need a rushed explanation. The silence itself was already doing part of the work for me. It changed the air around us. Nearby conversations slowed. More faces began turning in our direction. I stood straight and kept my eyes on Richard, not to intimidate him, but so he would understand that I had not come there by mistake. There were only a few steps between us now, and I could see exactly how hard he was working to stay composed, how carefully he was managing his face so the people around him would see nothing unusual. But that very control only made my presence more obvious. The people around us were beginning to understand that something was wrong. No one spoke for the next few seconds, but the atmosphere had already changed. The laughter had thinned. Conversations had lost their shape. Attention had gathered in the space between me and the man they all knew by another name. And in that moment, I understood I did not need to do anything dramatic at all. My presence alone had already created a question none of them could ignore. I took one more step, stopped right in front of the table with the cake, and this time I did not let the silence go on any longer. "It's a lovely party," I said, my voice just loud enough for the people nearest to hear clearly, but without any sharpness in it. That simple sentence made several heads turn completely toward me, as if they were all trying to understand what role I played in this scene. Richard stood across from me now with no real way left to avoid my eyes. Lisa moved one step closer to him and stood nearer than before, her expression shifting from guarded to openly protective. "Excuse me, who are you?" she asked, still polite, but unable to hide the tension rising in her voice. I looked at her for one brief second, then shifted my gaze back to Richard, because I knew the answer she needed should not come from me. That alone made everyone around us focus more sharply. The scattered chatter stopped completely. "I think he should answer that," I said, my tone as calm as before. There was no shouting in it, no rush, just certainty. And that made the sentence heavier than if I had raised my voice. Richard stayed where he was, shoulders straight, eyes flashing with the same kind of calculation I knew too well. He glanced around as though measuring how much attention the room had already given us, then turned back to me with a face carefully arranged into something neutral. "I don't know what this woman is talking about," he said, his tone even. It did not surprise me. I had expected exactly that. I gave the slightest nod, as though I had just heard something entirely reasonable, then reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. "Then maybe I should make it a little clearer," I said. I did not hand him the phone. I held it at an angle where the people closest to us could see. The first video showed him standing in front of the white fenced house, interacting naturally with the little boy, the kind of image everyone there would already recognize. But then I scrolled backward, moved through other clips and other angles, and finally stopped on an old photograph of him standing beside me in a life none of them had ever seen. "My husband died 8 months ago," I said, this time more clearly, though not any louder. At least that is what everyone, including me, was led to believe. Then I stopped talking and let the sentence rest in the open air, long enough for what they were seeing and what they were hearing to collide. Lisa looked down at the screen, then back at Richard. The expression on her face changed immediately. It was no longer just caution. It was the beginning of a question too large for words. "Daniel?" she said, calling him by that name, but in the way she said it, I could already hear how uncertain it had become. A few guests moved closer, trying to see the screen more clearly. Confusion spread through the group in a slow but unstoppable wave. "I have a death certificate," I continued, opening another image and holding the phone up higher so others could see it. "I have financial records, transfers made before he died, and I have proof of the life he is living now under another name." I did not rush. I did not let emotion spill into my voice. I understood by then that the weight of what I was saying did not depend on intensity. It depended on clarity. Richard could no longer maintain the perfect calm he had held before. He still did not react immediately, but his eyes were no longer steady. That alone was enough for everyone around us to realize something was deeply wrong. Lisa stepped back one small pace, not because she fully understood yet, but because that little distance was enough to make her see him differently. "I didn't come here to cause a scene," I said, lowering the phone slightly but keeping it in my hand. "I came here to ask a question he has refused to answer." Then I looked directly at him. "If you are not the man I buried, then say that in front of everyone here." No one said a word for several seconds. There was no laughter, no music, no chatter, only silence. And in that silence, I knew the story was no longer his to control. It had stepped fully into the light, and there was no way any of them could return to where they had been a few minutes earlier. No one there could hold on to their normal expression anymore, and that change spread faster than I expected. Their eyes moved from me to Richard, from the screen of my phone to the man they had just called husband, father, friend. Lisa said nothing for the first few seconds, but I could see it in the way she looked at him now. She was no longer looking at him with the trust she had worn a moment ago. She was reevaluating everything. "Daniel, what is this?" she asked, her voice not loud, but tight enough to reveal how strange she had become. Even the way she said his name had changed. It sounded less like certainty, and more like she was testing whether that name still fit the man standing in front of her. Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. He glanced around as if searching for support in the faces around him. but all he found there now was doubt. "I think this woman has misunderstood something," he finally said, but his voice no longer carried the steadiness it had before. That explanation did not lift the tension in the air. It only widened the space between what he was saying and what everyone had just seen. A man standing nearby stepped closer, looked down at my phone, then turned to Richard with open confusion. "I don't understand," he said. "Can you explain this?" It was such a simple question, but it pulled all attention toward Richard at once, and this time he could not redirect the conversation the way he had before. Lisa took another step back. The distance between them was not dramatic, but it was enough for everyone to see it. "I don't know who this woman is," Richard said. This time his voice aimed for calm, but his eyes could not hold steady. I did not interrupt. I did not need to. What I had already laid out was speaking loudly enough on its own. A few guests began whispering to each other, not because they wanted to intervene, but because they could no longer keep their thoughts to themselves. Lisa looked at me, then back at him, and I saw, clearly, the exact moment she understood that this could not be explained away as some simple misunderstanding. "You told me you didn't have a family before," she said, her voice lower now, but every word sharp and clear. "You said you were starting over." She paused, perhaps waiting for him to deny it, but he did not. The little boy stood nearby, too young to understand what was happening, looking up at the adults with open confusion. He tugged at Lisa's hand and asked her something, but she did not answer immediately. That made the whole scene heavier, because the truth was no longer touching only the adults. It had spilled into the life of a child who could not possibly understand what any of it meant. One of the guests stepped aside and pulled out a phone. His voice was low, but I heard the word police. Richard turned sharply toward the sound, and for the first time since I walked into that yard, I saw a real reaction from him. Not control, not calculation, but the recognition that the situation had moved beyond his reach. He turned back toward me, and this time his eyes no longer looked like denial. They looked like a man measuring how far things had already gone. I did not move closer. I did not say anything else. By then, my part in the moment was done. The truth had been placed where everyone could see it, not in a private conversation, but in front of the people who had all believed a different story. What happened next no longer depended on whether I chose to speak again. It depended on what each of them was going to do with what they had just witnessed. When the sound of sirens rose faintly in the distance, no one even tried to continue the party. The balloons still hung along the fence. The birthday cake still sat on the table, but no one was looking at them anymore. Richard stood there in the center of the yard, no longer the center of a celebration, but the center of a truth that had just been exposed. And for the first time, I saw him as a man who no longer controlled how his story would go on. What followed that afternoon did not happen in the loud, explosive way people might imagine. It unfolded in a slower rhythm, but with the kind of certainty that carries its own force. I was not the one pushing the legal process forward at every step, but once I handed over what I had gathered, the investigation moved faster than I expected. The authorities began verifying Richard's identity, comparing the records attached to the life he was living against the official files, and it did not take long for inconsistencies to appear. The identity of Daniel Moore no longer held together once it was placed under proper scrutiny. Documents that had once seemed complete were taken apart piece by piece, and it quickly became clear that parts of the identity had been fabricated or altered to fit the story he needed people to believe. It was not simply a matter of using another name. It extended into false declarations in a number of major legal and administrative procedures. At the same time, the financial issues I had uncovered were pulled into that same process. The money that had been moved before he died was traced backward, and related assets began to be frozen for investigative purposes. Accounts I had never been able to access before became subject to official review, and the financial picture I had pieced together slowly began to be confirmed through independent channels. I was not present for every meeting or every procedural step, but I was kept informed, and every new update strengthened what I already knew. What stayed with me most was not whether the process moved quickly or slowly, It was the fact that the system dealt with each detail clearly, one by one, without letting anything fall through the cracks. The things Richard had hidden for so long were now being brought into the light, not through emotion, but through records, data, and evidence. Richard could no longer maintain the life he had built. Once the identity cracked, the whole structure around him started collapsing in pieces. The people who had trusted him were forced to face the truth directly. The relationships he had constructed in that second life could no longer hold steady in the same way. He was made to answer for what he had done under the law. I did not need to witness every second of it to understand what was happening. The outcome had become inevitable the moment the truth was placed where it belonged. As for me, the assets tied to our marriage were reviewed again, and the rights I had once assumed were gone began to be reconsidered in an entirely different light. What I had gathered did more than reveal Richard's actions. It ensured that the things that belonged to me were not erased along with the false story he had constructed. The process did not resolve in a single day, but each step brought a feeling that things were slowly returning to their proper order. When I walked through the neighborhood in the afternoons, I no longer felt like someone who had lost part of her life. I felt like someone stepping into a new chapter with a clarity I had never had before. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. I no longer needed to hold on to what did not belong with me anymore. What I had now was the ability to choose how I would continue. And this time, that choice would not be shaped by the assumptions I had once trusted. I understood that this journey would not end in one moment. It would continue over time, through adjustments and changes I would still have to face. But the difference now was that I no longer felt dragged through someone else's story. I was writing my own next chapter on purpose, and that shift, quiet as it was, gave me a steadiness I had never known before.
If you're still here with me now, all the way at the end of this story, then I don't think you're just listening anymore. I think you're really reflecting. I'm Sophia, and today I don't want to end Margaret's story only with what happened. I want to talk about what it truly means, especially for the women who have been in, or are still in, a situation that feels painfully similar. I've told many stories, but one thing always repeats itself, no matter how different the circumstances are. Betrayal rarely begins with one big moment. It starts with very small things. A comment brushed aside, a question left unanswered, a discomfort we talk ourselves out of by saying, "Maybe I'm overthinking it." And over time, those small things build up. They create a gap so gradually that we don't even notice it. Until one day the truth steps into the open, and there is no way back. Margaret's story is not only about a husband who faked his death. What makes this story so haunting is that she lived beside a man for more than 30 years, and still did not know the full truth of who he was. And if you think that sounds too far-fetched, then I want you to stop for a second and ask yourself, how much of the people closest to you do you really know? We tend to believe that time creates understanding, but time, without honesty, only creates familiarity. And familiarity can be dangerous because it makes us stop asking questions. We see someone every day, hear their voice, share space with them, and start believing we know them, when in reality, we may only know the version they chose to let us see. There is something else I want to say, especially to the women listening to this. Silence is not always strength. Margaret stayed silent for a very long time in her marriage, not because she was weak, but because she trusted. But when silence stretches on too long, it can become an empty space other people use to write a different version of your life, one you were never invited to shape. How many times have you felt that something was off, but chose not to say anything? How many times have you convinced yourself that everything was fine just to avoid a difficult conversation? I'm not saying every suspicion is correct, but I do believe your feelings always exist for a reason. And listening to yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. This story also gives us another harsh truth. Not everyone will choose you, even when you think they should. Margaret's son knew the truth, and he still chose silence. That does not make him some purely evil person, but it does show us something important. Every person makes their own choices, and sometimes those choices will not be made in your favor. And this is the most important thing I want you to remember. Your value does not depend on whether someone else chooses you or not. Margaret was left behind. She was shut out of a story she once believed was hers. But that did not diminish her worth. What made the difference was the way she stood up, gathered the truth, and faced it without allowing emotion to blur her clarity. You do not need to become strong overnight. You do not need a perfect plan. But you do need to be honest with yourself. You need to be willing to look directly at the things that make you uncomfortable instead of avoiding them. Because when you refuse to face them, someone else will decide where your story goes next. And I want to say one more thing, something that may not be easy to hear. Not every story ends with everything being repaired. Sometimes maturity means accepting that certain things happened, and the best thing you can do is keep walking without carrying what broke you. That does not mean you forget. It means you refuse to let the past control your future. If you see yourself anywhere in this story, if you have ever felt left behind, dismissed, or shut out of your own life, I want you to know this. You are not alone. There are so many people out there living through something similar. They just haven't said it out loud yet. And sometimes, hearing a story like this is the first step towards seeing your own life more clearly. So if you're still listening right now, I truly want to know where you are. Leave a comment below so I can see how far this story has reached, and if it resonated with you. If there was even one moment that made you stop and think, leave a like, so I know this story became something more than just a story for you. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this, stories that are not just meant to entertain, but to help us understand, confront, and grow, then subscribe to the channel. I'm Sophia, and I'll see you again in the next stories where maybe you'll find a part of yourself waiting there,